Good day, economics students, and welcome to another online economics instruction video. The purpose of this video is to investigate all of the microeconomic principles associated with pure monopoly. Students who are viewing this video should have already been introduced to the principles and concepts related to the four market models of pure competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly in the previous lectures. And we also investigated all of the economics and principles related to perfect or pure competition. So this is sort of phase two in our study of the four market models, remembering that imperfect competition refers to monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. Let's talk about the chapter objectives for this particular area of study. First, the characteristics of a pure monopoly. In other words, what make this firm a monopoly? And they're pretty simple. A monopoly is an industry dominated by one big player. They're producing a product for which there's no close substitutes and significant demand. More about that in a moment, but those are the big ideas. We will follow a similar path on determining how does a pure monopolist set profit maximizing output and therefore price. We're going to talk about the monopolist being a price maker. So similar to our approach to determining profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output for a firm competing in a purely competitive industry, we will participate in the same type of activity from the standpoint of monopolist. We will talk about the economic effects of monopoly, remembering that in our purely competitive model, perfect competition yields price at minimum average total cost and price at marginal cost for each firm in the long run, which eventually produces productive and allocative efficiency for society. We will reinvestigate those ideas and explain why, under a monopoly situation, we have failed to achieve both productive and allocative efficiency, and really what the economic effects or consequences of the monopolist dominating an entire industry has on society. Now, we'll talk mostly about a single price monopolist. In other words, a company or corporation that dominates an industry and they charge the same price for every unit of output they sell. But we will investigate towards the end of the chapter the possibility of monopolists charging different prices in different markets if possible, if they can differentiate the market. So, characteristics of monopoly. All right. So, first, single seller. In other words, one firm is the industry. So, think of Microsoft from 1986 through 2000s, where pretty much 94% of all personal and professional computers around the world were running Microsoft operating systems. So, a single seller, right? You could think of back in the day when Rockefeller owned all of the oil in the United States. He bought up all these small oil drillers and became the monopolist when it came to that particular product. So single seller. Single seller, and point number two, the market, there's no close substitutes. In other words, whatever that firm is producing, you really have to buy it from them if you want it, because there's no way to substitute some other good or service. So single seller and no close substitutes. Point number three is extremely important here. Price maker. Unlike a firm operating in a purely competitive industry with a standardized product where each firm is a price taker, we're going to see mathematically and graphically how and why a monopolist has significant control over price. Not absolute control over price, but significant control over price. We will discover and investigate the reasons how and why this firm, the monopolist, is able to make economic profits for a long period of time, and that has to do with barriers to entry. The monopolist has achieved monopoly power by blocking entry from potential competitors into this market. We will discuss on the next slide some of the barriers to entry that a monopolist can erect to keep potential competitors from entering their industry. Non-price competition. Will a monopolist advertise? This one might be counterintuitive. You think, well, If we're the only game in town, we're producing a product for which there's no close substitutes, and we're a price maker, why would we advertise? But sometimes it makes sense for monopolists to advertise because they simply want to increase demand for their good or service. The classic example of this is AT&T. When AT&T was the only choice for long-distance service, AT&T would often advertise to encourage people to call their friends and family, just to reach out and touch someone. That used to be their slogan. Say hello to somebody you haven't spoken to, whether it's a friend or family or grandmother and such. And obviously, it just enticed people to use their service more, so it increased demand. The other reason why the monopolist might advertise, goodwill. In other words, the monopolist doesn't want to be seen as the evil empire that controls or dominates an industry. So they may engage in some form of non-price competition, like sponsoring your local marathon and donating the money to a charity. Right? Now, examples of monopoly. Well, we have to talk about the difference between a regulated monopoly and a non-regulated monopoly. So, when we begin our study of the characteristics and behaviors of a monopolist in earnest, we're going to assume that the monopolist is not being regulated. In other words, the government is not taking action to oversee their behaviors and set price in the market. That is to say, the monopolist can set prices of the good or service at whatever level they wish, based on the demand for that good or service. So, most of the examples of monopolies that you are familiar with in your life are what we refer to as regulated monopolies. The natural gas company, the water company, the electric company, they all deliver one service to your house. The government has granted them monopoly power. So there are plenty of examples of regulated monopolies. Another regulated monopoly might be before Uber and Lyft, when a city or a town gave taxi licenses to only one company. And they figured, okay, by granting only this one company the rights to own and operate a ride service in this geographic region, they could have some control over the quality of that service. Figuring it's somewhat a public good because there's a social benefit to having a company who's reputable giving rides to business men and women to and from conferences and such, or to and from work, and to tourists and such, right? Now, De Beers used to own something close to 89% of all of the diamond reserves in the entire world. So they had a virtual monopoly on diamonds. So there's been examples of near monopolies. Western Union used to have a monopoly on the whole delivery system service, whether it was Western Union delivering a telegram or delivering money, right? Until the advent of electronic transfers became universally and widely accepted, Western Union had a monopoly on that particular service. Frisbee, they came up with the toy that everybody knows and loves. So there are examples of monopolies in the history of U.S. economic history, as well as globally. De Beers is an international company. The dual objects of study. First is, well, we're going to compare and contrast the monopolist behavior with that of a purely competitive firm. So how does the monopolist make pricing and output decisions relative to a purely competitive situation? And the second area of study really stems just from that. In other words, let's look and say, okay, what's the real cost to society of allowing a monopolist to exist, and should we regulate the monopolist? Now, the regulation piece is also a tricky question to answer. So we'll talk about the behavior of monopolist, then we'll talk about the possibility of the inefficiencies associated with monopoly, and if and when it makes sense to regulate the monopoly. Okay, barriers to entry. So think of these as a system where the one firm which dominates the industry, which is producing a product for which there are very few substitutes and is therefore a price maker, how can they prevent competitors from entering that industry and eroding their monopoly power? The first one, economies of scale. You should remember this from our study of the theory of the firm and cost structure of the firm, especially in the long run. Economies of scale refers to the idea that a company has grown so massive through capital investment in equipment, machinery, and the plant that they can achieve a average total cost per unit much lower than any other firm who would attempt to enter that industry. So if you think in simple number terms, if we can produce 3,000 automobiles per day or per week, we can achieve an average total cost per vehicle much lower than a firm, much less than a firm that is producing, say, only 100 or a couple hundred cars per week. So therefore, being large creates an economic advantage. Being able to produce that product at a much lower average total cost per unit means it's easier to achieve a profit and nearly impossible for a new firm to enter that industry because the capital investment necessary to get into that market would be massive and almost insurmountable. Okay. Now, legal barriers to entry. Patents. So a pharmaceutical company starts to investigate the use of some chemical combination. They file for a patent. From the day they file, they have a 25-year right to exclusive use of that patent. Now, not from the day that that drug is approved by the FDA, from the day they file for the patent. Now, of course, they want to start the patent process as soon as possible so they can protect themselves against another pharmaceutical company discovering the same or similar chemical combination. But the patent lasts for 25 years, even if the drug's not approved until 8 years after the file was patented. All right, licenses. I mentioned in the previous slide the idea of a taxi service, that the government may provide a legal license for one company to own and operate a virtual monopoly in a geographic region just because it may benefit society and may be easier to police that particular company. All right, ownership or control of essential resources. There's a resource called bauxite. It's the major component making aluminum. Alcoa at one point owned nearly 90% of the world's bauxite. Therefore, Alcoa had a monopoly in the production of aluminum. In other words, nearly impossible for any other company to even think about entering that market and competing because one company, Alcoa, owned the necessary or essential resources. Pricing and other strategies. Well, pricing, let's think about this. If we're the big, giant boy on the block, so to speak, we know that it's going to take significant investment for a new competitor to enter this industry. They may perhaps have an opportunity, but what if we were to sell our product intentionally at a loss for a short period of time? And this would almost force any potential competitors to abandon their attempt to enter the market because new firms can't suffer a loss. So an existing firm that has monopoly power, that has good balance sheet, could actually set its price lower than its cost for production and suffer a short-run loss just to thwart potential entrants from entering that market. Now, other strategies, this is something that's more recent that makes really good example of what we're studying. Let's say that you're Facebook and you're afraid that a new social media platform may interrupt your dominance in that area. So instead of allowing the new participant to just enter the market and become the new popular social media outlet, you could try another strategy once this becomes a go-to for a certain segment of the population, and you could buy them. And that's exactly what Facebook did with Instagram. And we see this all the time when Amazon and other companies such as Apple buy smaller companies. And it's one of the interesting areas of how these companies continue their market dominance by purchasing potential rivals. All right, so we're going to investigate demand as experienced by the monopolist, by the single firm selling that product for which there's no close substitutes. A couple big assumptions here. First one, the firm, the company, has secured monopoly status. And that is because they have erected one of the aforementioned barriers to entry. All right, so either they have control of the resources or they have a patent, or they have huge economies of scale, right? So monopoly status is secure. For the time being, this is a non-governmented regulated monopoly. No government intervention in this monopoly. We'll investigate that case later on when we say, what if the government does regulate this company, but for now, this is a non-regulated monopoly. All right. Last assumption is extremely important to understand. This firm is a single price monopolist, and what this means, they charge the same price to all customers for every unit of output. We'll see mathematically that a firm would love to be able to differentiate and sell certain units at a higher price and additional units at a lower price, but that's not the case in this example. Single price monopolists. So at this point, they can't discriminate price based on the willingness of potential customers to pay. All right, 3 important ideas, economic principles, concepts related to monopoly demand. So at all level of output beyond the first unit of output, marginal revenue is less than price. So what's marginal revenue? Anything marginal thinking means change, right? Change in total revenue associated with selling the next unit of output. All right, so how much additional revenue does the firm receive from selling its next unit of output? Marginal revenue. So in a purely competitive market, we observed that marginal revenue equaled price because each firm was a price taker at the market price, and the market price was determined by the interaction of thousands of buyers and sellers. There's only one seller in this case, the monopolist. But if they want to sell additional units, they have to lower price. So we will see mathematically and graphically how and why marginal revenue is less than price for every level of output beyond number 1 for the monopolist. Point number 2, why are we even studying this chapter? Because monopolist has power. What do we mean they have power? They have pricing power, right? They dominate the market. So we will see again mathematically and graphically how and why a monopolist is a price maker. How a monopolist is a price maker. The last important point here regarding monopoly and monopoly demand, elasticity. Now what is elasticity? Remember, it's what? It's a measure of how responsive are buyers to changes in price, right? So if you remember our study of the chapter of elasticity, we identified the idea that if buyers are quite responsive to price changes, we refer to that as demand being elastic. So sometimes a small change in price, say a small increase in price, customers will react by buying far less, right? Elasticity was measured percentage change in quantity demand over percentage change in price. The monopolist will always set price in the elastic region of the demand curve. There were 2 ways to determine elasticity of demand when we studied this concept earlier. We could calculate the coefficient of elasticity, and we interpreted it as saying any coefficient of elasticity calculated greater than 1 means demand is elastic. Buyers are responsive. Any coefficient of elasticity less than 1, demand is relatively inelastic, not all that responsive. But another important determinant was called the total revenue test. Remember that if demand is elastic, price and total revenue move in the opposite direction of one another. Price down, total revenue up. Price up, total revenue down. The monopolist will always choose to set price in the elastic region of the demand curve because of this idea, the idea of the inverse relationship between price and total revenue. All right, let's look numerically and graphically at this relationship between price and marginal revenue, and why marginal revenue is less than price at every level of output beyond the first. So let's use an example and say, okay, this monopolist, right? They've secured monopoly power. They're a single price monopolist. Price maker. They're selling 3 units at $142 per unit. Total revenue, 3 times 142. If the firm wants to sell more, they have to lower the price. Now here's the deal. It's an all or nothing proposition. The monopolist doesn't have the luxury of saying, hey, we'll sell the first 3 units at $142 because those buyers are willing and able to purchase at that price. And then sell the 4th unit at a lower price, 132. What happens is they sell all 4 units at the lower price. So all the buyers pay $132 per unit and not 142 for 3 of them and 132 for the last one. So they all pay the same price. Remember, because this monopolist can't price discriminate. They're a single price monopolist, right? So what happens here is that total revenue increases first by $132, but minus $30. Now, what does this mean, right? Well, the firm sold the next unit at $132, the 4th unit, but they sold the previous 3 at $10 less than they would have sold them, right? So 142 minus 132 is 10 times 3. They lose 30, but they gain 132. So what happens to marginal revenue in total? Well, in total, marginal revenue increases by $102. And that becomes a point on the marginal revenue curve at output level 4. We can simply carry out this same exercise to determine the other points on the marginal revenue curve. But the conclusion should be obvious here. At all level of output beyond number 1, marginal revenue is less than price. And it's because of that phenomenon we identified earlier. It's an all or nothing proposition for the monopolist, right? They can't price discriminate. Let's look at the cost and revenue data for this firm to help determine what level of output will maximize profit or minimize loss in the short run. When we attempted this exercise for a firm competing in a purely competitive market, we employed the MR equals MC rule. That is to say, we determined what level of output, what quantity, we call it Q star, what quantity of output would maximize profit or minimize loss by equating marginal revenue to marginal cost in the short run. When we introduced that principle, we said it applies equally to all 4 market models, not just to a firm competing in a purely competitive market. So we're going to use the same exact approach for a pure monopolist that we use for a firm competing in a perfectly competitive pure competition model. Right? So, okay, how does this firm determine what level of output will maximize profit or minimize loss in the short run? Look at column 1, which is quantity of output. Look at column 4, which is marginal revenue, and identify column 7, marginal costs. So, okay, the marginal revenue associated with producing the first unit of output, 162. Marginal cost, 90. Marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost? Yes, that makes sense. We keep playing that game. Wait, 142 is greater than 80. 122 is greater than 70. 102 is greater than 60. 82 is greater than 70. We would definitely produce 5 units of output. But what happens at the 6th unit of output? The marginal revenue, the change in total revenue associated with producing the 6th unit of output is only 62, and the marginal cost, which is to say how much additional cost the firm incurs from producing that 6th unit of output, is 80. So at 6, marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. Therefore, this firm should produce 5 units of output and make an economic profit of $140, right? Now, the answer is on the board there, $140 of profit for this firm in the short run. How did we get that number? Well, there's also information on here that makes it much easier to calculate than may otherwise would be. You can look at column 3, total revenue, minus column 6, total cost. So 610 minus 470, it's 140. It's one approach to determining profit or loss for the firm. That's the easiest approach. Let's assume that column 3 and column 6 were not available. Right? Well, how else could we determine for this firm what the economic profit will be? Okay, we could take per unit profit and multiply it by the quantity we are producing. Right? So per unit profit would be price 122 minus average total cost at Q star at 5, which would be 94. Right? So 122 minus 94. Multiply that by 5, and that will also yield 140. Two approaches to coming up with the same number. Okay. This looks familiar to us because we examined something highly similar to this when we studied the example of the movie theater, when we studied elasticity of demand, right? We've simply added the marginal revenue curve to this graphical representation of these principles. So up top we have the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve for our monopolist. Down bottom we have the total revenue curve. Right? Earlier we said the monopolist always chooses to set price in the elastic region of the demand curve. Always chooses to set price in the elastic region of the demand curve. So we look at this range. Say, okay, the firm's going to set price somewhere in that range, that price range. Why? Because, all right, remember, the relationship between price and total revenue and demand is elastic, right? If demand is elastic, decreasing price will increase total revenue. So along that segment of the demand curve, the firm could lower price and increase total revenue. Notice that as long as demand is elastic, the total revenue curve down bottom is rising. All right. Now, we said this a few chapters ago, but it's worth reviewing and reiterating. Every downward sloping demand curve typically has an elastic region and an inelastic region. So notice beyond some point, demand turns relatively inelastic. That is to say, consumers are not as responsive to change in price, right? The firm would be foolish to ever set price in the inelastic region of the demand curve because lowering price would actually lower total revenue for the firm. And you can see how marginal revenue turns below zero beyond the point where demand is elastic. So again, the firm will always choose to set price, if it's a monopolist, will always choose to set price in the elastic region of the demand curve. Let's examine the same ideas we covered on the previous slide, but instead of using numbers, let's use graphical representation. MR equals MC. Our marginal cost curve, blue curve, our marginal revenue curve. This firm determines profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output by equating MR to MC, right? This firm will definitely produce 5 units of output in the short run where the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Right? Now, what price will the firm charge? Remember when we studied a purely competitive market, we said marginal revenue equals price. Marginal revenue is equal to price. But that's because each firm was a price taker. In a monopoly situation, each firm is a price maker. So this is a good graph because it helps you visualize the idea of pricing power for the monopolist. So if we look at this point where MR equals MC, that white dot, we say, okay, the firm doesn't have to settle for price all the way down there. This firm will equate price to demand at 5 units of output. So at $122, buyers are willing and able to purchase 5. So if we look at the distance between that white dot where MR equals MC and that black segment of that line drawn from the white dot up to the demand curve, that represents the pricing power of a monopolist, right? Now later on we'll talk about the inefficiencies of monopolists, but we say how is it that a monopolist is a price maker and not a price taker? Well, remember, the firm doesn't have to settle for a price where equal to marginal revenue. The firm can set price equal to demand, how much buyers are willing to purchase at 5 units of output. That turns out to be a price of 122. This firm will make an economic profits in the short run, right? This lime green rectangle represents the economic profit enjoyed by the monopolist. If you remember back to dynamic adjustments and the idea of market efficiencies and the rationing function of prices and the invisible hand. In a purely competitive market, we said, well, those economic profits would not persist for a long time because new entrants would make their way into the market and the supply curve would shift to the right, and then there would be a lower price, right? But this firm has created or erected barriers to entry, preventing any potential rivals from entering this market. Therefore, we could assume that economic profits could persist for quite some time for the monopolist, right? So this firm will make an economic profit, and they will do so because price is greater than average total cost at 5 units of output, right? So look at the relationship between average total cost and price. We draw a nice little rectangle, yields an economic profit, and we believe that these could persist for some time into the future as long as the barriers of entry that have been erected by the monopolist prevent new competitors or new rivals from entering this market. Okay, quick review. Monopolist is a price maker. We saw that with the relationship between marginal revenue graph, the demand graph, and where the monopolist chooses to set price. Monopolist is a price maker, right? Monopolists will always choose to set price in the elastic region of the demand curve. 2 slides ago, we showed that relationship. We said the firm would never set price in the inelastic region of the demand curve because at that point, price and total revenue moving in the same direction would be bad for the firm, right? How does the firm determine output and pricing? They use the MR equals MC rule just like we studied for pure competition. Here's an interesting observation about the situation with a monopoly. There's no market supply curve. Why? Well, one firm dominates the industry, and that firm will choose to produce the level of output where price is equal to demand at that particular level of production for the firm. In other words, the firm chooses to produce the level of output based on their cost structure and demand. It has nothing to do with market supply. So it's an interesting situation. When we study a pure monopolist, there's no market supply curve. A couple misconceptions about the monopolist. First, the monopolist does not charge the highest possible price. The monopolist charges the profit maximizing price, right? Again, the monopolist doesn't charge the highest possible price, it charges the profit maximizing price. All right, we identified this when we looked at a previous example of they could have charged much higher than 122 and sold some units, but it harkens to here, point number 2. The monopolist is attempting to maximize total, not per unit profit. Total, not per unit profit. Now, another misconception about monopolists is that they actually have the potential to suffer losses. So, this is microeconomics. Think for a moment macroeconomics. When would a monopolist possibly suffer losses? Well, there are costs of production, fixed costs, variable costs associated with the monopolist. If the economy were to head into a severe recession, there could be a significant decrease in the demand for the product or service offered by the monopolist. Similar approach to determining for this firm, one firm dominating the interest, monopolists, if they should produce, what level of output should they produce? They should produce where? MR equals MC. Okay, we see that. What price will they charge? All right, they will charge a price all the way from the white point where MR equals MC come together up to the demand curve. Now, the good thing for this firm is that price is still above average variable cost, but price has fallen below average total cost. Therefore, this firm will operate in the short run, but they'll suffer a loss. Similar to the ideas we studied for a firm operating in a purely competitive market. If this firm continues to produce, they'll suffer a loss less than their fixed cost, which is good, right? Because you figure if your fixed costs were $100 million per month, you'd rather lose 30 or 40 million than 100 million. Fixed cost, unavoidable, not related to the firm's level of output. So this could happen if, think about a more local monopoly. Let's assume that one concrete company dominates the entire southeast Pennsylvania region, right? So concrete used in many building projects. If the economy heads into a severe recession, demand for their products is going to decline significantly, causing the pure monopolists to suffer short-run losses. They would expect their economic outlook to improve once the economy got back on track. Let's talk about the inefficiencies of monopoly, right? Now, how are we going to examine the inefficiencies of monopoly? Well, we will compare the efficiencies of a purely competitive market situation to what happens or occurs when one firm dominates the industry. On the left-hand side, we have purely competitive market. On the right, pure monopoly. Let's review pure competition before we examine the inefficiencies of pure monopoly. All right, downward sloping demand curve, easy enough. Pure competition, various amounts of good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase, series of price, specified amount of time. Ceteris paribus, other things equal. Each buyer in this market pays PC, we'll call that the competitive price, and there's a quantity QC produced. So in a purely competitive market model, we assume that buyers acting in their own rational self-interest to maximize utility, sellers acting in their own rational self-interest to maximize profit, drives the market to the most efficient outcome. Why? Well, look at the supply curve. It says S equals marginal cost. If you remember our study of pure competition, we identified an important relationship between the marginal cost curve and the supply curve in the short run. The firm will choose what quantity to produce by equating MR to MC as long as marginal revenue is equal to or greater than average variable cost. So, therefore, the supply curve in a purely competitive market equals the marginal cost curve. One firm's marginal cost curve is highly similar to all the firms because they all face the same structure, the same cost structure. So in a purely competitive situation, we achieve both allocative and productive efficiency. First, productive efficiency. In the long run, price equals minimum average total cost. That is to say, each firm is adopting the least cost method of production, using the least amount of resources necessary to produce this product or service because they're forced to continually update their manufacturing process and use the most technologically advanced approach to manufacturing because they're price takers. Likewise, allocative efficiency, price equals marginal cost. The exact amount of resources that society deems desirable to produce this good and service happens where price equals marginal cost. What about the monopoly situation? Well, the monopolist, they choose to restrict output, right? We see this here. They don't produce QC, they produce QM. QM is the monopoly level of quantity produced. And what price do they charge? Well, they charge a price higher than what would have occurred in a competitive situation. So the monopolist is failing to achieve both productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. Why? Because not producing as many as society would otherwise desire. Society wants to have enough resources allocated to the production of this product or service to produce QC level of output. But the monopolist is restricting output to QM, right? Plus, the firm is going to charge a price above what would happen in a competitive situation. Price is above marginal cost, right? So therefore, this firm is definitely not achieving productive efficiency. Let's look at this relationship in another way and introduce what we call dead weight loss. We introduced this principle a few chapters ago, but quick review. On the left-hand side, pure competition. On the right-hand side, pure monopoly. Remember what we meant by consumer and producer surplus. If we look at the price that each buyer pays in the markets relative to what they were willing and able to pay for this product or service. So if you look at the downward sloping demand curve and you start on the vertical axis and you trace the demand curve from where it hits the vertical axis down to the point of equilibrium, and then you follow the dotted line over to P comp, or price in a competitive market, we've created a nice little triangle. That triangle represents consumer surplus. Below that triangle is another triangle, and that represents what? The price that all the sellers would have been willing and able to accept as for sale, but they all received the market price, right? So think of it like this. There was a whole litany of buyers that were willing and able to pay a price higher than the competitive price, but they purchased the product at the competitive price, PCOM. There were a whole group of sellers that were willing and able to accept for sale a lower price than they would have than they had to accept, right? So they all received an efficiency as well. So producer and consumer surplus. We believe that producer and consumer surplus is maximized under a purely competitive market situation. The natural forces of supply and demand determining outcome through the rationing function of prices, the invisible hand. All right? Allocation of resources is efficient. Each firm must adopt the least cost method of production. Look what happens on the right with the monopolist. If you look at that purplish triangle and the green triangle, that represents to society dead weight loss. The purplish triangle, that's the net loss of consumer surplus. And the green triangle, that's the net loss of producer surplus. What we're saying here is that fewer of these units are being produced. Q1 was desired by society, but the monopolist only produces Q2. And the cost to produce them is actually higher than would be in a purely competitive situation. Inefficiency. In a purely competitive market model, we achieve by default allocative and productive efficiency. Unfortunately, the monopolist fails to achieve either productive or allocative efficiency, and the result is inefficiency loss, dead weight loss, some shared by the consumer and some shared by the producer. On the previous two slides, we demonstrated graphically and discussed the inefficiencies of a pure monopolist. Just like many things in economics, it's a little bit more complicated than first glance, right? Now, we do believe that generally speaking, because price is higher than would otherwise take place in a purely competitive situation, and the output is restricted, that there is some type of loss for society, right? An efficiency loss. We also believe that what happens is that there's an income transfer. And by income transfer, we mean an income transfer from those who purchase the product or service to the company who's selling it, right? But it's not always as straightforward as it may seem, right? Number one is that when you talk about the cost of production for a monopolist, when you talk about large-scale manufacturing, it actually might make sense to allow one company to dominate the industry because they can achieve economies of scale far greater than if 10 or 100 or even 1,000 firms split the market up. There's two other ideas here, and they relate to sort of the side effects of a monopolist and somewhat to do with economies of scale. Why is it far more efficient for everyone to use Microsoft Office and PowerPoint, Word, and Excel than to have other Office suite options? Now, let's assume for a moment that Microsoft Office isn't necessarily the greatest software available to everyone who wants to produce a spreadsheet, a slideshow, or a Word document. But once everyone is using it, right, there's crazy network effects. In other words, I can create an Excel spreadsheet, have all these accounting formulas on it. I can send it to my business partner. That business partner can read it immediately. They can look up and say, as long as I give them the rights, they can see where I'm calculating the data, right? And I can send it halfway across the world. Right? That idea of a network effect is extremely important. The other idea is called simultaneous consumption, right? You think about Netflix. Netflix only has to produce a show one time, right? And then it could be simultaneously consumed by however many viewers the system will support, right? So that type of economies of scale would not be achievable if we had 1,000 firms competing in the market, right? So it's interesting. Netflix had for a time being here a monopoly on streaming, and then of course Amazon Prime came along, and now we have Disney Plus. But this idea of simultaneous consumption and network effects tend to offer, say, a counter argument against the inefficiencies. Let's discuss further economic effects of monopoly. The first one's called X inefficiency. In theory, a monopolist should be able to achieve economies of scale. A very large capital investment allows the firm to produce a product at an average total cost much lower than would otherwise take place if several firms divided the industry. So think of this average total cost curve as the potential average total cost curve for the monopolist. In theory, the firm should achieve an average total cost per unit of ATC2 if they could produce Q2, and they should achieve an average total cost of ATC1 if they produce quantity 1. However, investigation suggests that there are inefficiencies of growing too large. For instance, you have workers who may be disgruntled or uninterested. You have managers who rest on their laurels. The company itself may not always be seeking out the latest and greatest approach to producing its good or providing its service, and therefore, large is good, but too large leads to inefficiencies. So if you look at the X and X prime, we say, okay, and instead of achieving average total cost per unit along the average total cost curve, they're slightly higher because of this X inefficiencies. Now, rent-seeking behavior refers to, when a firm, they seek an economic advantage based on what we would say is trying to or attempting to gain added wealth without any reciprocal contribution to productivity. That's typically how we would explain something like rent-seeking behavior. So, for instance, the monopolist has sway, and they can use lobbyists or they can use pressure on politicians to argue for maybe tariff protection or some type of tax break, right? So those type of behaviors are inefficiency from the standpoint of the big guy gets the break, the little guy doesn't get the break. Right? Now, another problem with monopolists is that if you have 100 firms or even 1,000 firms competing, they're forced to continually seek out the least cost method of production, and therefore, the competition by default enhances technological advancement because each firm who has only a small percentage share of the market and is in many ways a price taker looks to advance their technological know-how and therefore reduce their cost structure. This doesn't happen in the monopoly situation. The monopolist is happy being in charge and oftentimes doesn't even consider new methods of production which could lead to a more efficient method of, the process that, takes the product from drawing room to finishing line. Up to this point, we assume that the monopolist was charging the same price for every level of output it produced. However, what if the monopolist could discriminate, right? What if the monopolist could discriminate? So there's 3 forms of price discrimination. The monopolist could charge each customer the maximum they are willing to pay. So literally discriminate based on a customer's willingness to pay. All right? The monopolist could charge each customer one price for the first set of units purchased and then a lower price for subsequent units. And then the third, which is the most common, is charging some customers one price and a different set of customers other prices. So, there are certain conditions which need to be met in order for a monopolist to even consider the possibility of price discrimination. The first one's simple enough. The monopolist has secure monopoly power, right? Barriers to entry. Number 2, that with very little effort, the monopolist can segregate the market. In other words, divide those who are willing to pay one price versus another price, or those who are willing to pay the highest possible price. So they could achieve this particular objective without exerting a great deal of energy. The other condition is interesting is that I can't take what I buy from the monopolist and turn around to sell it to someone else, right? That would be the greatest gig ever. Like, well, if you're going to segment the markets, right? If you're going to discriminate based on price, I'll buy it at the lower price. I'll turn around and sell it to somebody who's willing and able to buy it at the higher price. Well, we also assume that there's no option for resale, right? So monopoly power, easy to segregate the market, and no possibility of resale. All right. Now, airfares. When you go to book a flight, typically you need 14 days or better to get the best deal. Not always. There are times when they will send out emails or text messages letting you know that you can get some super crazy deal if you book the flight now, but those are not the norm in the industry. Why is it that airlines will charge the customer who's willing to book the flight 14 days or more in advance a lower price than if you wait until, we'll call it, the last 2 weeks or the last minute? Because airlines know that emergencies happen, right? They know that people have no choice. Remember, one of the determining factors of elasticity of demand is the time factor. God forbid one of your loved ones gets sick or is in an accident. You're getting on the next plane to wherever they live. Now, you live in Colorado and they live in Florida. You're going to get there as soon as you can. You don't even look at the price of the flight. You don't want to pay a high price, but you got to pay it. All right, if you're a businesswoman or a businessman and there's a customer who needs assistance and they're a great customer, right, and you're in Boston and they're in Boise and you got to get there, you're paying for that flight. So it's a really good example of price discrimination based on willingness to pay. Right? Theaters are a really interesting study, right? Because airplanes typically don't offer this discount where they say, hey, there's only 2 hours till the flight takes off. We'll sell you a price at 1/3 of the typical seat for that flight. But theaters do it all the time because there's two reasons for this. Number one is that it's easy for theaters to take advantage of people who are willing to come in at the last minute, unlike taking a flight somewhere. The other reason is that if you're owning and operating a theater, the success of your show is determined not only by the creativity of the product itself or the service and the actors and actresses involved, but the audience in some way. So if you have a show with a very little audience, you can have a spectacular performance and it's, so it is underappreciated, right? So in that regard, it makes sense for theaters to almost give tickets away the last hour before the show. If you've ever been to New York City, you see this all the time where you have people sconced in the street saying, hey, if you want to go see a comedy show, it's $5 or $10. You want to go see this show, it's $15. So at the last minute, you can get really good deals on theaters. Golf courses have a similar luxury as far as segmenting the market. Some people don't want to play golf in the afternoon when it's hot, right? Let's face it, 94 degrees at 1 o'clock. It's only going to get hotter between then and 3:30. So they'll charge a lower price to customers who are willing and able to purchase that service in the heat of the afternoon than somebody who says, hey, I'm getting in there 6:30 a.m. before it gets ungodly hot, and I'm going to enjoy myself so I'm not completely drowning in sweat by the time I'm finished playing. So golf courses. Now, electric utilities are interesting, right? Because there's a lot involved with this idea of electric utilities. When you think about first of all, how power is generated, when there's massive demand, we use coal and natural gas. When there's less demand, we would use, if possible, wind and solar plants because they're not being keyed up for the spectacular demand that happens, say on a hot summer day in the middle of Arizona, right? So that's one interesting thing about electric utilities. But utility companies will charge more for electricity during peak hours than non-peak hours. And they'll also charge more for manufacturing firms than they will for residents because they know the manufacturing firms don't have a choice. All right, so here's price discrimination based on two potential groups of buyers. So let's assume this is a software that is used for logistics systems, right? So let's say it's a high-end, extremely efficient software, and if you have a company and you have logistic concerns, you need software to run your logistics system, this is excellent software. So on the left-hand side, you can see that the demand by small businesses for this particular, we'll call it a service, we'll call software a service, right? Demand tends to be relatively inelastic, not all that responsive to price. So notice that the firm says, hey, we can charge a relatively high price, we can increase price and increase total revenue because demand's relatively elastic, right? So therefore, this firm who sells this software, we'll call it ABC software, they will sell to small business customers at a higher price than they will to students. Now, the interesting thing is you can think of students as like, added income for the firm, for ABC software. So in addition to having a version of this logistics software that has all the bells and whistles, they can strip down the software, take out some of the bells and whistles, and sell it to students as a learning tool, right? Maybe some of you have taken a class in advanced operations management and you actually have to purchase software for that course. Well, you're paying much less for that software than if you were running a business. Notice that demand by students is far more elastic, much more price sensitive. So the ABC software company charges a much lower price, PS per unit, as opposed to PB for the businesses. Again, an example of a monopolist who can segment the market, right, charge one group one price and another group another price. Okay, this idea of natural monopoly. We only want one natural gas company in our neighborhood. You don't need 5 companies digging up pipes and therefore maintaining the infrastructure associated with that grid, right? Likewise, you don't want 7 companies offering electric service in your neighborhood because determining who was at fault and which company's lines were broken or crossed. So we call this idea of a natural monopoly, that it makes sense to allow one company to dominate that market. But we're not going to just turn a blind eye to that company. We're going to regulate that monopoly. So here's the problem. We have this idea of what rate should we allow the monopolist to charge, right? So if we allow them to charge whatever price they wish, we already went through that scenario. We saw the scenario of how a monopolist determines price based on demand and maximizes its profit. What we're going to discuss now is say, okay, if we regulate the monopolist, when we go about regulating this monopoly, we have 2 choices. We can charge we can allow them to charge what's called the socially optimal price, or we can allow them to charge what's called the fair return price. Now notice what's going on at each one of these. P equals MC at socially optimal price. P equals ATC at fair return price. P equals MC is what? What does that mean? That means this firm is achieving productive efficiency, right? Least cost method of production. Fair return price, we're hoping that maybe not productive efficiency, but at least providing enough of the service such that the resources being allocated to produce this good or service maximize the happiness of all parties under consideration. Let's look at this graphically. Okay, this is your non-regulated monopoly. Non-regulated monopoly says, okay, we'll produce where MR equals MC, right? QM, and we will charge price PM. Simple enough. We already covered that situation. What happens, though, if we allow this monopoly to exist and we decide your local utility, natural gas, water, electric company, we're going to regulate this monopoly. So, if we force the monopolist to charge what's called the socially optimal price, right, which is PR here, remember? PM, monopoly price, PR, socially optimal price. We have a little problem, dilemma issue. At that price, the firm is losing money. Notice that PR, price, is less than average total cost per unit. We can't have that because even though this firm's a monopolist and they're providing a service that's necessary for a community, they won't continue to operate if they're suffering losses, right? Especially in the long run. So there's an issue with regulating the monopoly and choosing a price that's socially optimal. Let's consider, instead of the socially optimal price, what we call the fair return price. Notice the fair return price is set where average total cost intersects with demand and price is set at PF, fair return. Now hopefully many of you are thinking of this idea as I was discussing the possibility of the monopoly price, the socially optimal price, and the fair return price. This looks all well and good in theory. In reality, there's many more issues to consider, right? Costs are continually changing in industries, and the demand for this service is probably ebbing and flowing with the economy and perhaps the growth, or we'll say reduction in the size of this community. So in theory, we get the idea. Allow monopoly to exist, grant it monopoly power because it's a natural monopoly, regulate the monopoly, but choosing a price that actually equates to fair return, price equals average total cost, not always as easy in reality as it seems on this graph. Good luck with the rest of your study of monopoly. Back soon with monopolistic competition and oligopoly.